When spring searchers found what remained of Jacob Keller in April of 1903, they discovered his body less than 40 yards from his cabin door, positioned face down in what had been deep snow, but was now melting slush. His hands frozen in positions suggesting he had been crawling toward the shelter that had been visible through the falling snow, but that had become unreachable once the storm intensified beyond the point where forward progress was possible, and once the decision to leave the cabin transformed from brief errand into fatal miscalculation. The cabin itself stood intact with the door closed but unlatched. Jacob had not locked it when he left, because he had expected to return within minutes, had expected only to check the nearest section of his trapline during a temporary lull in the snowfall that had confined him for 3 days, and had not anticipated that the lull would end while he was still outside, or that ending would bring snow so heavy and wind so strong that the 40 yards between trapline and cabin would become 40 yards he could not traverse, despite being able to see the cabin through the white curtain that separated him from survival. Inside the cabin, searchers found evidence that Jacob had been living normally until the morning he departed. Food prepared, but uneaten. Fire burning low in the stove. Equipment arranged as if he intended to return and resume the routines that frontier isolation required. But he had not returned. The snow that had been falling lightly when he left had resumed falling heavily while he was checking his traps, had created conditions where visibility dropped to feet rather than yards, where wind made forward movement nearly impossible, and where the simple act of walking from trapline back to cabin became a struggle that Jacob lost despite being close enough to see his destination, and despite understanding that reaching it was the only thing standing between him and death from exposure in wilderness that offered no other shelter. Welcome to this journey through one of the most devastating examples of proximity, meaning nothing when weather creates barriers that distance cannot measure. In the years when trappers working isolated territories had to balance the need to check trap lines regularly against the risk of being caught outside during storms, when brief lulls in snowfall seemed to offer windows for completing necessary work before storms resumed, when the distance between cabin and trapline could be measured in yards but could become uncrossable in minutes if conditions changed faster than a person could return, when seeing your destination and reaching your destination were different things. Once wind and snow created resistance that exceeded human strength to overcome, there lived a man who left his cabin during what appeared to be a safe interval, who walked 40 yards to check traps that needed checking, and who died trying to walk those same 40 yards back because the storm that had paused resumed with intensity that made even short distances impossible to traverse, and that demonstrated how weather can trap someone, not by taking them far from shelter, but by making the short distance to shelter into a distance that cannot be closed, no matter how desperately closing it is attempted. Leave a comment where you're watching from as we trace the line between calculated risk and miscalculated conditions, between 40 yards that can be walked easily and 40 yards that become impossible when snow falls fast enough and wind blows hard enough to transform proximity into irrelevance. This video is a work of fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons living or dead is purely coincidental. Before we follow Jacob out that cabin door and watch distance and weather conspire to prevent his return, consider what storm lulls meant to trappers and why experienced wilderness workers understood that lulls were tempting, but dangerous, that snow stopping temporarily did not mean snow had stopped permanently, that brief clear intervals could end as suddenly as they began, and that leaving shelter during a lull was gambling, that conditions would remain manageable long enough to complete the task and return before the storm resumed. Trap lines required regular checking, Animals caught in traps needed to be retrieved before scavengers found them. Traps needed to be reset while they were still functional, and delays of days or weeks meant lost productivity and wasted effort. But checking trap lines during active storms was suicidal. Visibility in heavy snow dropped to the point where navigation became impossible. Wind created conditions where moving forward required effort that quickly exhausted even strong men, and cold penetrated clothing in ways that created hypothermia within minutes once exertion stopped. The solution was to wait for lulls, to watch the storm, to identify moments when snow lightened and wind moderated, and to use those moments to complete necessary work before the storm intensified again. The risk was that lulls were unpredictable. They might last hours, or they might last minutes, and someone who left shelter during a lull gambling that it would persist long enough for them to complete their work and return might find themselves caught outside when the lull ended and when the storm resumed with intensity that made return impossible even across distances that should have been trivial. Experienced trappers developed judgment about lulls. They learned to read weather, to estimate how long a lull might last, to calculate whether the work they needed to do could be completed within the time available. They learned to err on the side of caution, to accept that missing a day or two of checking trap lines was preferable to being caught outside when a lull ended unexpectedly. They learned that proximity to cabin meant nothing if weather made that proximity uncrossable, that being 40 yards from shelter was no safer than being a mile from shelter once visibility dropped 2 inches and wind made forward movement impossible. But even experienced trappers sometimes miscalculated. Even those who understood the risks sometimes convinced themselves that a lull would last long enough, that the work was important enough to justify the risk, that they could complete the task and return before conditions deteriorated. And sometimes those miscalculations were fatal, not because the trapper went far from shelter, not because they took unnecessary risks by traveling into unknown territory, but because they walked 40 yards from their cabin door during what seemed like a safe interval and found themselves unable to walk those same 40 yards back when the interval ended, and when the storm that had paused resumed with force that made even the shortest distance into a distance that could not be closed. Jacob Keller was 37 years old in the winter of 1902 to 1903, an experienced trapper who had worked wilderness territories for 14 years, who was known among other trappers as a careful man who made conservative decisions and who prioritized safety over profit in ways that had allowed him to survive 14 winters without serious incident. He had established a trapping camp in a remote section of the Ozark wilderness, approximately 28 miles east of what would eventually become Alton, Missouri, in an area known for productive trapping, but also known for severe winter weather that could make the region inaccessible for weeks or months once heavy snow began to fall. Jacob's cabin was well positioned and well constructed, located in a small clearing that provided access to water and to the forest where trap lines could be set, built solidly enough to withstand winter storms, and stocked with supplies sufficient for several months of isolation. His trap lines were set in patterns that radiated from the cabin in distances that ranged from very close. The nearest traps were only 30 or 40 yards from the cabin door, to much farther out in areas where game was more abundant, but where checking required travel that could take hours. The winter of 1902 to 1903 began early and began severely. By mid-November, heavy snows had already fallen, and by December the accumulation was substantial enough that Jacob found himself confined to his cabin for days at a time, waiting for lulls in the storms that would allow him to check his trap lines and to maintain the work that made winter trapping profitable. Through late December and early January, Jacob managed. His confinement, well, he waited out storms, he used lulls to check traps, he brought in enough fur to make the season productive, and he maintained the routines and the judgment that winter survival required. But on the morning of January 14th, 1903, Jacob made a decision that would prove fatal. A decision that seemed reasonable in the moment, that was based on conditions as he observed them, but that failed to account for how quickly conditions could change and how drastically change could affect even the shortest distances. The previous 3 days, January 11th, 12th, and 13th, had brought continuous heavy snow. Jacob had been confined to his cabin, unable to check any of his trap lines, watching through his window as snow accumulated, and knowing that traps he had set were sitting unchecked, that animals might be caught in them, and that the longer he waited to check them, the more likely it was that the catch would be lost to scavengers or that the traps would be buried and rendered unusable for the remainder of the season. On the morning of January 14th, Jacob woke to find that the snow had stopped. The storm had not ended completely. The clouds remained heavy and dark. The wind continued to blow in gusts that suggested more snow was coming, but the active snowfall had paused. The pause created a lull, created a window during which work could be done before the storm resumed. Jacob stood at his cabin door, looking out at the landscape. The accumulation from the previous 3 days was substantial, perhaps 3 feet of new snow on top of what had already been on the ground, creating depths that made travel difficult, but not impossible. Visibility during the lull was reasonable. He could see the tree line where his nearest trap line began, could see the general area where his closest traps were located, could estimate that checking just the nearest section of the line would require perhaps 30 minutes of work if he moved efficiently. The conservative choice was to wait, to see if the lull would persist, to see if conditions would improve further, to avoid leaving the cabin until he was certain that the window for work was long enough to complete the task safely. But Jacob had been confined for 3 days, had traps that needed checking, and had the kind of restlessness that confinement created in men who were accustomed to activity and who found sitting inside while work went undone to be difficult. He made the decision to check the nearest traps, just the closest section of the trap line, just the traps that were 30 to 40 yards from the cabin, just a brief trip that should take 15 or 20 minutes total if he moved quickly. He would leave the cabin, walk to the nearest traps, check them quickly, and return before the lull ended. The risk seemed minimal. The distance was short. The work was necessary. The lull appeared stable enough to allow completion of this limited task. Jacob dressed in his warmest clothing, layering against the cold that the lull had not diminished even though it had temporarily stopped the snow. He did not take extensive supplies. He expected to be outside for 20 minutes at most, expected to remain within sight of the cabin, expected to return before any supplies beyond what he wore would be necessary. He checked that he had his knife, checked that his mittens were secure, checked that his coat was fastened properly against wind that continued to gust even during the lull. He opened the cabin door and stepped outside. The cold struck him immediately, the kind of cold that late morning in mid-January in the Ozarks created when storms were present, cold that made breathing uncomfortable and that penetrated even through layers of clothing if exposure continued for more than brief periods. But Jacob had experienced this level of cold many times. He knew how to manage it, knew how long he could safely work in it, knew that 20 minutes outside would be uncomfortable but not dangerous if he kept moving and if he returned to the cabin before his core temperature began to drop. He closed the door behind him but did not latch it. He expected to return within minutes, expected to push it open easily when he came back, saw no reason to secure it when he would be re-entering so soon. The decision to leave the door unlatched was practical and reasonable for someone expecting a brief absence. It was also a decision that would later seem significant to those who found his body. The unlatched door had been waiting for him to return, had been accessible, had required only that he reach it to re-enter the warmth and safety it represented. Jacob walked away from the cabin toward the tree line where his nearest trapline began. The snow was deep, but not impossibly so. He could wade through it, could make progress toward his destination, could cover the 40 yards to the first trap in a few minutes of difficult but manageable effort. The visibility during the lull allowed him to see the cabin behind him, to orient himself by its position, to know that returning would simply require reversing his path. He reached the first trap. It was buried under new snow, but he could locate it by memory and by the markers he had set. He cleared the snow, checked the trap, empty but undamaged and still functional. He reset it, covered it properly, and moved to the second trap a short distance away, also empty. He reset it. He moved to the third trap. This one had caught something, a small animal that had died in the trap and that was now frozen solid, but that still represented value if he could get it back to the cabin. He removed the animal, reset the trap, and turned to head back toward the cabin. And that was when the lull ended. The snow began again, not gradually, not with warning, but suddenly and heavily. Within moments, the gentle snowfall that had been absent during the lull was replaced by the heavy snowfall that had been falling for the previous 3 days, by wind that had been gusting during the lull, but that now intensified into sustained force that drove snow horizontally rather than allowing it to fall vertically, by conditions that transformed the landscape from visible to obscured within the time it took Jacob to realize that the lull had ended and that he needed to return to the cabin immediately. He could still see the cabin, barely. Through the falling snow and through the wind that was now blowing hard enough to make standing upright difficult, he could make out the dark shape of the structure, could see that it was in the direction he needed to walk, could estimate that it was perhaps 40 yards distant. The same 40 yards he had walked to reach the trapline, the same short distance that had seemed trivial when he left the cabin minutes earlier. He began walking toward it. The snow that had been manageable during the lull was now resistant. The wind was filling in the tracks he had made. Walking out to the trapline was creating drifts that made each step require significant effort, was driving snow into his face in ways that made keeping his eyes open difficult, and that made breathing require turning his head away from the wind. But he could still see the cabin. He could still move toward it. He could still make progress, even though progress was harder than it had been, and even though the wind and snow were making forward movement increasingly difficult. He covered perhaps half the distance, 20 yards from where he had been standing at the trapline, 20 yards still to go to reach the cabin door. And then, visibility dropped further. The snow intensified beyond what it had been moments before, and the wind increased beyond what he had thought possible, and the cabin that had been visible as a dark shape against white background became invisible, became lost in the white that was now all around him, became something he knew was ahead, but that he could no longer see to navigate toward. Jacob stopped, tried to orient himself, tried to determine if the direction he was walking was still the direction that would take him to the cabin, or if he had drifted off course in ways that the loss of visibility prevented him from detecting. He knew the cabin was close. He had covered half the distance, should have only 20 yards remaining, should be able to reach it if he could just maintain the correct direction through conditions that were now making direction difficult to maintain. He continued forward. Each step required effort. The snow was above his knees. The wind was strong enough that maintaining balance required concentration. and the cold was beginning to penetrate his clothing in ways that suggested his body heat was being drawn away faster than his exertion was generating it. But he was close to the cabin. 20 yards, perhaps less. He just needed to keep moving forward. But forward movement was becoming harder. The wind was making each step exhausting, was depleting his energy faster than he had anticipated. The snow was accumulating on his clothing, adding weight that made movement harder. Jacob began to realize that he was in serious danger. He tried to move faster, tried to push through with increased effort, tried to close the remaining distance before his strength failed, or before the cold created hypothermia that would make movement impossible. But increased effort brought increased exhaustion, and the cycle was creating a situation where each minute outside was making the next minute more difficult. The exact timeline of Jacob's final minutes can only be reconstructed from evidence, from where his body was found, from the position he was in, from the conditions that existed on January 14th. But the sequence seems clear from what was found. Jacob continued moving toward where he believed the cabin was located for some period of time, perhaps minutes, perhaps longer, fighting through conditions that were now beyond what allows normal forward movement. At some point, his forward progress stopped being progress and became merely effort. He was moving, but no longer covering ground, expending energy without achieving the movement that energy was meant to create. And at some point, he fell, whether because his legs could no longer support his weight, or because the wind knocked him off balance, or because exhaustion and cold had progressed to the point where standing was no longer possible. The result was the same. He went down into the snow, and getting back up required more strength than he had remaining. But he did not accept it immediately. The position of his body when it was found, face down, arms extended forward, hands positioned as if trying to pull himself forward, suggested that even after falling, he had continued trying to reach the cabin, had attempted to crawl toward it, had used what strength remained to move inches or feet toward the shelter that he knew was close, but that he could no longer see and that he could no longer reach by standing and walking. The crawling likely achieved some forward progress. His body was found closer to the cabin than the trapline was, suggesting he had covered most of the 40 yards between them before he stopped moving. But the crawling also exhausted him, used the final reserves of energy he had, created a situation where forward movement eventually stopped, not because he chose to stop, but because his body could no longer respond to commands to continue. And once movement stopped, hypothermia completed its work quickly. Lying in snow, soaked with sweat from exertion and with melted snow that had penetrated his clothing, unable to generate heat through movement, Jacob's core temperature would have dropped rapidly. Consciousness would have faded, not necessarily in a way that Jacob was aware of the fading, but gradually, progressively, as his brain's function diminished with decreasing temperature, and as the awareness that death was approaching was replaced by the kind of detachment that severe hypothermia creates before death occurs. The snow continued to fall through the afternoon and evening of January 14th, covering Jacob's body, adding to the depth that had made his return impossible, creating the burial that he had tried to avoid by returning to the cabin, but that had caught him anyway, because 40 yards had been too many yards to cross in conditions that made even short distances impossible. When the storm finally ended on January 15th, Jacob's cabin stood as it had stood before, door closed but unlatched, waiting for an occupant who would never return to close it properly, surrounded by snow that had accumulated during the storm and that had buried everything around the cabin, including the body that lay 40 yards from the door. Through the remainder of January and through February and into March, the cabin remained sealed by snow, blocked by winter conditions that made the region inaccessible. No one could reach it to check on Jacob. No one could determine whether he had survived the winter, and no one could know that he had died within sight of his cabin door during a brief trip outside that should have been safe, but that had become fatal when the storm's lull ended and when 40 yards became a distance he could not traverse. Spring thaw in late March made the region accessible again. Other trappers and neighbors who knew Jacob had been working in the area organized an expedition to check on him, to verify his survival or to find his body if he had not survived. The journey to his cabin revealed heavy snow still present, but melting, creating conditions where travel was difficult, but possible. When the searchers reached Jacob's cabin, they saw immediately that something was wrong. The door was closed, but showed no recent signs of use. No footprints near it, no disturbance in the snow around it, suggesting that no one had entered or exited recently. They called out, hoping Jacob would respond from inside. No response came. They approached the door, pulled it open. It was unlatched, opened easily, and entered the cabin expecting to find Jacob dead inside from illness or starvation, or any of the causes that could kill someone during winter isolation. But Jacob was not inside. The cabin was empty of human presence, though full of his belongings and full of evidence that he had been living normally until he left. The searchers stood in the cabin trying to understand. If Jacob was not inside, where was he? If he had left the cabin, where had he gone? And most importantly, if he had left during the winter, how had he survived, or where had he died? They began searching the area around the cabin. The snow was melting, but substantial amounts remained, making systematic searching difficult. But within minutes of beginning their search, they found him, less than 40 yards from the cabin door, buried in melting snow, positioned face down with his arms extended forward in the classic position of someone who had been crawling and who had stopped crawling because movement was no longer possible. The searchers cleared the snow from Jacob's body, confirmed that he was dead and had been dead for months, and tried to understand what they were seeing. A man who had died 40 yards from his cabin door. A man whose cabin door had been unlatched and waiting for his return. A man who had been close enough to see his destination, but who had not been able to reach it before. Hypothermia and exhaustion stopped his movement, and before the storm buried him in snow that would not reveal him until spring, made discovery possible. They examined his body for clues about what had happened. He was dressed for outdoor work, but not for extended exposure. His clothing was adequate for checking trap lines during calm weather, but inadequate for surviving a major storm. He was carrying one small frozen animal, the catch from the trap he had checked before attempting to return. He had no pack, no extensive supplies, nothing that suggested he had intended to be outside for more than a brief period. They entered the cabin again and examined it more carefully. The stove contained old ashes. Fire had burned at some point, but had gone out long ago, probably when Jacob left and failed to return. Food was present, partially consumed supplies that suggested Jacob had been eating normally before whatever happened happened. Equipment was arranged as if he had been living, routinely. Nothing suggested panic or crisis or awareness that he was about to die. On the table was a plate with food prepared, but uneaten, suggesting that Jacob had made breakfast on the morning he left, had planned to eat it when he returned from checking traps, and had never returned to consume the meal that had been waiting for him. The searchers tried to reconstruct what had happened based on the evidence. Jacob had left the cabin during a lull in a storm, intending to check his nearest trap line. He had walked the short distance to the traps, had checked them, had found one catch. He had turned to return to the cabin. The lull had ended while he was making his return, and the storm had resumed with intensity that made the return journey impossible to complete. He had struggled through snow and wind, had covered most of the distance, had fallen or collapsed when he could no longer continue standing, had attempted to crawl the remaining span, and had died from hypothermia before he could reach the cabin door that was visible from where he fell, and that remained unlatched and accessible. But that was 40 yards away, and that might as well have been 40 miles, once conditions made those 40 yards impossible to cross. Jacob's body was recovered, was taken back to the settlement, was buried in the small cemetery that served the scattered community of trappers and frontier residents. His belongings were claimed by distant family. His cabin was eventually used by other trappers who knew the story of what had happened there, but who needed shelter and who were willing to overlook the cabin's history in favor of its utility. The story of Jacob Keller became a cautionary tale among trappers, a reminder that lulls and storms were dangerous because they created the illusion that conditions were safe when conditions were merely temporarily improved, that short distances meant nothing when weather could make any distance impassable, and that leaving shelter during winter storms was gambling that the window for safe work would remain open long enough to complete the work and return before the window closed and trapped you outside in conditions that could kill you even if you were only yards from safety. We have reached the end of this journey through one of the most devastating examples of proximity, meaning nothing when storm conditions make distance impossible to close. A trapper who left his cabin to check trap lines 40 yards away, who died trying to return through conditions that made that distance impossible to traverse, and whose body was found in spring, positioned as if still trying to reach the door. He could see, but could not reach, before cold and exhaustion stopped his movement permanently. If you've made it this far on this journey through territory, where 40 yards can become impossible distances, when snow falls heavily enough and wind blows strongly enough, consider subscribing to Commute Tales for more stories that explore the boundaries between calculated risk and fatal miscalculation. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on Jacob's decision to check the trap line during the lull. And if this story resonated with you, a like helps bring these narratives to more people. Until our next journey, remember that somewhere in the Ozark wilderness, there is a cabin where a door once stood unlatched, waiting for a man who died 40 yards away trying to reach it, proving that distance means nothing when weather creates resistance, that strength cannot overcome, and that seeing your destination and reaching your destination are different things when the space between them fills with snow that will not stop falling and wind that will not stop blowing until the person trying to cross that space stops moving and accepts the cold that has been waiting to claim anyone who misjudges how quickly conditions can change and how drastically change can affect even the shortest journeys.